Now, the last part of Whyte's essay, which is really his kind of main conclusion, has to do with settler colonialism. So I described to you briefly what settler colonialism is earlier, but I've offered some direct quotes from Whyte's paper on this slide. And Whyte's main conclusion is that settler colonialism always results in a particular kind of environmental injustice, namely in a challenge to the collective continuance of the indigenous societies where the settlers colonize. And he describes this as follows. Settler societies are motivated to relocate and establish a new homeland for themselves as part of their own adaptation to external forces. You can think of that in a way, think about it as a description of the European settlers in North America. The common story is they were motivated to come to North America because of religious persecution in their home countries, lack of economic opportunity in their home countries, and so on. So they are themselves responding to external forces in settling North America, in moving over to North America. So settler societies are, as any society, concerned with their collective continuance, Whyte writes. Given the institutional, ecological, and experiential aspects of collective continuance, settlers can only make a homeland by creating social institutions that physically carve their origin, religious and cultural narratives, social ways of life, and political and economic systems, for instance, property, into the waters, soils, air, and other environmental dimensions of the territory or landscape. In other words, they have to change the socio-ecological context and transform it in accordance with their moral terrains. They have to reshape nature and the whole human relation to nature in the area where they are in accordance with their moral terrains and their collective continuance. And that means that settler ecologies have to be inscribed into indigenous ecologies. In other words, there has to be a reshaping of the land and human relation to the land that, to some extent, erases the moral terrains or replaces the moral terrains of the indigenous societies. Yet for settlers, the indigenous ecologies testify to origin, religious and cultural narratives, societal ways of life, and political and economic systems that owe nothing to those same aspects of the homeland settlers seek to inscribe. For settlers, indigenous socio-ecological contexts challenge settlers' claims to have honorable and credible religious missions, universal property rights, and exclusive political and cultural sovereignty. So the point there is that settler societies will experience indigenous ecologies and indigenous moral terrains as a threat to themselves because they don't match the settlers' moral terrains and the kind of socio-ecological context that they want and need to set up. So it's a kind of tragic conflict here that Whyte is describing, which of course one can read as part of an argument for rectifying the kind of injustice that settler colonialism does on the indigenous moral terrain, systems of responsibility, and collective continuance. The last point that's made is about some examples of a phenomenon that Whyte describes as the goal of settlers is actually to eliminate themselves as settlers. In other words, the sort of perfect success of settler colonialism would be to have the settled land, the settled place, be perceived entirely as the natural home of the settlers rather than of the indigenous people. And so anything that kind of helps to create and support a narrative of the settled land being naturally the settlers will, and that erases the claims to the land of the indigenous people, will be preferred. And some examples of this that Whyte gives are narratives of American wilderness, which mask the histories of displacement of indigenous people. So a lot of the American wilderness areas, including like national parks, could only have been set aside in the way they were by displacing or removing or denying the claims to that land and to a particular moral ecology, a particular moral terrain in relation to that land of indigenous people, and also places of beauty separated from human non-recreational activities such as indigenous traditions. So I just wanted to highlight that kind of connection with wilderness, the idea of wilderness that has been discussed in some of the other things that we've read.